This is Mr. Wesley, and somewhere between the settlement being signed and the rest of your life beginning, someone decided it was your fault she is lonely, not in a courtroom, not in any official proceeding, in the quieter and more pervasive way that cultural narratives assign blame, in the language of the therapists and the self-help books and the social circles and the documentary specials and the ongoing public conversation about gray divorce that has developed an extensive and sophisticated vocabulary for female post-divorce loneliness, while consistently and specifically locating its cause in the man who was in the marriage with her. You were emotionally unavailable. You were not present enough. You did not do enough of the emotional labor. You did not meet her where she was. You did not grow at the same rate she grew. You did not provide the specific and sustained emotional attunement that the marriage required for her to feel genuinely connected, rather than genuinely alone inside it. The loneliness she experienced, in the marriage and after it, is the product of your failures as a partner. That is the story. That is the cultural narrative that has been running around gray divorce for the last 2 decades, and that most men who have been through one have encountered in some form either during the marriage itself or in the professional and social landscape of the aftermath. And here is what I want to say about that narrative today. It is not entirely wrong. The emotional availability failures I have described across this series are real. The bid system failures are real. The invisible accumulation of unmet needs is real. The contribution that male emotional unavailability makes to female loneliness in long marriages is real and documented, and deserves to be taken seriously as part of an honest accounting of what goes wrong in marriages that fail after 50. But the narrative is not entirely right either. And the part that is not right, the part that assigns the totality of the loneliness to the man's failures while exempting from examination, everything else that contributed to the relational dynamic, is the part that is doing the most damage to the men who are trying to recover from the divorce while carrying the full moral weight of an accounting that was never complete to begin with. That incomplete accounting is what today is about. Stay with me, because in a few minutes I am going to give you the specific and honest examination of what the accountability epidemic in gray divorce actually consists of, what is accurate in it, what is distorted in it, and what the distortion is costing the men who have accepted it as the full truth of what happened in their marriages. There is one specific dimension of the distortion in particular that produces the most damage to a man's recovery, and that I want to make sure you have clearly before this video ends. But first you need to understand why the narrative developed the shape it has, why the cultural conversation around gray divorce loneliness is organized the way it is organized, and why that organization systematically excludes a significant portion of what actually happened. I am Mr. Wesley. This is Relational Insights, and this is the accounting that finally includes both sides of the ledger. Let me give you the mechanism behind the narrative first, because the mechanism explains why the narrative is as one-sided as it is, without requiring the assumption that anyone involved in producing it was being deliberately dishonest. The cultural narrative around gray divorce loneliness was built primarily from one source of data, the therapeutic and clinical literature on female experience in long marriages that fail. That literature is substantial. It is serious. It is the product of decades of genuine clinical work with women who are experiencing genuine and significant distress inside and after long marriages that did not meet their relational needs. The findings of that literature are real. The emotional labor asymmetry is documented. The bid system failure is documented. The specific and sustained loneliness of a woman who is emotionally alone inside a marriage that is otherwise functioning is documented with the kind of consistency and the kind of clinical precision that produces legitimate and important conclusions. What that literature was not designed to do, what it was not structured to capture, and what its methodology did not prioritize, was the equivalent experience of the man inside the same marriage. Not because the researchers were indifferent to his experience, because the men in those marriages were not in the therapist's office. They were not generating the clinical data. They were doing what men of their generation were trained to do with relational difficulty, managing it privately, performing functionality publicly, and not seeking the professional support that would have put their experience into the clinical record in a form that the literature could have incorporated. The narrative is one-sided because the data it was built from was one-sided, not because one side's experience was fabricated, because only one side's experience was systematically recorded in the form that clinical and cultural narratives are built from: the man's experience, his loneliness inside the marriage, his specific and often invisible suffering in the post-divorce years, his own unmet needs, and his own accumulating grief, and his own legitimate account of what the marriage had been and what it had cost him. That experience did not enter the clinical record in the same volume or with the same specificity that her experience did, and the narrative that the clinical record produced reflected that asymmetry. This is the foundation of the accountability epidemic, not malice. Asymmetric data producing asymmetric narrative, producing asymmetric cultural accountability. The man who is being held responsible for the totality of the loneliness is being held responsible in a framework that was built from an incomplete picture of the situation he was actually in. Now let me give you what the complete picture actually contains. Because the complete picture, the one that accounts for both parties' experience rather than privileging one as the primary data and treating the other as the contextual background, changes the accountability calculation significantly. The first thing the complete picture contains is the male loneliness that the narrative has been systematically excluding. The research on male loneliness and long marriages is less extensive than the equivalent research on female loneliness, in the same context for the reasons I described above, but it exists, and its findings are specific and significant. Men in long marriages that are in the stages of the quiet death I described in the previous video experience loneliness at rates and with an intensity that the cultural narrative has not acknowledged with any consistency. The specific loneliness of a man whose wife has emotionally departed while remaining physically present. The loneliness of a man who has been trying to reach a partner, who has crossed the threshold into detachment, and who is encountering, in response to his attempts at connection, the flat affect reception I described in the 6 Signs video. The loneliness of a man who is aware that something is wrong in the marriage, and who does not have the framework to name it or the social permission to talk about it with the people around him. That loneliness is real. It was running in the marriage while her loneliness was running. Both parties to the quiet death of a long marriage are lonely inside it. The narrative that assigns the loneliness exclusively to her, and the cause of the loneliness exclusively to him, is a narrative that has decided, on the basis of incomplete data, that his loneliness does not count as loneliness in the relevant sense, and that her loneliness is the primary moral fact of the situation. That decision is not supported by the complete picture of what the research actually shows. The second thing the complete picture contains is the relational dynamic as a system rather than as a series of male failures. The accountability narrative treats the relational failures of the marriage as the product of male behavior. His emotional unavailability, his bid non-responsiveness, his failure to develop at the rate the marriage required. It treats these behaviors as independent variables whose effects on the marriage's health are the primary story of what went wrong. What the complete picture requires is the recognition that relational dynamics are systems, that the behaviors of each party are both causes and effects within a dynamic that neither party is fully controlling, and that neither party's behavior can be adequately understood in isolation from the behavior of the other party in the same system. The demand-withdraw cycle that I described in an earlier video in this series is the most documented example of this systemic dynamic. The cycle in which she raises demands and he withdraws and his withdrawal produces more demands and her demands produce more withdrawal is a cycle in which both parties are both causing and responding to the behavior of the other. The clinical literature has, for reasons related to the data asymmetry I described above, tended to locate the primary pathology of this cycle in the withdrawal rather than in the demand, to treat male withdrawal as the independent variable whose modification is the primary intervention point. But the research on the demand-withdrawal cycle is more complex than that framing suggests. The demand behavior and the withdrawal behavior are mutually reinforcing. The cycle has 2 engines, not one, and the accountability framework that treats the withdrawal as the cause and the demand as the effect is making a directional claim about a bidirectional dynamic that the research does not fully support. This is not an argument that male emotional withdrawal is not a problem. It is a problem. It is a significant and well-documented contributor to marital deterioration, and I have addressed it directly and without minimization across this series. It is an argument that the accountability framework that assigns the totality of the relational failure to the male side of a bidirectional dynamic is making a claim that the complete evidence does not support. Picture this. There is a man I know, I will call him Bernard, who came out of a 26-year marriage at 62, carrying the specific and sustained weight of having been told, by the therapist they had seen during the difficult years of the marriage, by the friends who had organized their sympathy around his wife's experience of the marriage, and by the cultural narrative that surrounded him in the aftermath, that the loneliness his wife had experienced across those 26 years was the product of his emotional unavailability. Bernard had accepted this accounting. He had internalized it as the accurate and complete story of what had gone wrong. He had spent the first 2 years after the divorce in the specific and contracted position of a man who has accepted full moral responsibility for the failure of something he built alongside another person, a position that produced a recovery that was slower and more painful and more limited than his actual situation warranted because he was navigating it from inside the weight of an accountability that was never complete to begin with. When Bernard eventually encountered a more complete accounting of the marriage, one that included not only his emotional availability failures, but the specific relational dynamics that had contributed to those failures, the specific ways in which the demand-withdraw cycle had been running in both directions, the specific and significant ways in which his own loneliness inside the marriage had been invisible to the narrative that had developed around her experience of it. Something shifted in him, not the assignment of blame to her, not the rejection of his own responsibility for his contribution to what happened. The specific and significant relief of a man who has been carrying more than his share of the weight of a shared failure, and who has finally been shown that the weight he has been carrying was never the complete and accurate accounting of what happened. Bernard told me that the shift was not comfortable. Taking responsibility for your contribution to the failure of a long marriage is not comfortable. But carrying full responsibility for a failure that was shared, that was the product of a dynamic that ran in both directions, that was contributed to by both parties, that cannot be accurately accounted for by the examination of one party's behavior in isolation from the others, is more than uncomfortable. It is a specific and sustained form of injustice that the man who accepts it is perpetrating against himself. And the recovery from gray divorce that begins from inside that injustice is a slower and more contracted recovery than the one that begins from the more complete and more honest accounting of what the marriage actually was and what its failure actually consisted of. Now let me give you the specific dimension of the distortion I promised you, the one that produces the most damage to a man's recovery, and that I want to make sure you have clearly. It is the accountability asymmetry in the post-divorce years, not in the marriage. I have addressed that above. In the years after it ends, the cultural narrative around gray divorce loneliness does not end when the divorce is finalized. It continues into the post-divorce years in a specific and consequential form. The woman who is lonely after the gray divorce, who is navigating the post-divorce years with the specific and significant challenges of the sunset window I described in an earlier video, who is encountering the relational landscape as a woman over 55, with the specific demographic challenges that landscape presents, is embedded in a cultural framework that acknowledges her loneliness as real, sympathizes with its causes, and organizes support around its alleviation. Her post-divorce loneliness is visible. It is named. It is the subject of books and podcasts and therapeutic frameworks and community support structures that are specifically designed to address it. The man who is lonely after the gray divorce, who is navigating the post-divorce years with the specific and documented challenges I addressed in the suffering differential video, with the social isolation and the health deterioration and the psychological recovery delay that the research consistently identifies as more severe for men than for women in this demographic, is embedded in a cultural framework that continues to hold him responsible for the loneliness he is experiencing. The narrative does not shift when the marriage ends. The accountability does not pause to acknowledge that he is now also lonely, also suffering, also navigating a post-divorce landscape that is significantly more challenging than the cultural narrative around male post-to-divorce freedom suggests. The accountability continues. The loneliness he is experiencing in the post-divorce years is framed, when it is framed at all, as the deserved consequence of the emotional unavailability that produced the loneliness in the marriage. He is lonely because he was emotionally unavailable. The loneliness is the appropriate outcome of his failures. He has earned it. That framing is not only inaccurate, it is actively harmful to the recovery of a man who is already navigating one of the most challenging transitions of his life, with fewer social resources and less cultural support than his situation actually requires. The man who accepts the framing, who internalizes the post-divorce loneliness as the deserved consequence of his marital failures, rather than as the predictable and addressable outcome of the specific and documented mechanisms I have described in this series, is the man whose recovery is most delayed and most contracted by a weight that was never the accurate or the complete accounting of his situation. Here is the accounting I want to offer instead. Your emotional availability failures in the marriage were real. Your contribution to the bid system failures was real. The specific ways in which your limited emotional skill set contributed to the relational dynamic that produced the marriage's ending were real, and they deserve honest acknowledgement as part of the complete picture of what happened. I have not minimized them across this series, and I am not minimizing them now. And the accounting of what happened in your marriage is not complete without them. It is also not complete with only them. Your loneliness inside the marriage was real. The specific relational dynamic in which both parties were both contributing to and responding to the difficulty was real. The ways in which the cultural and clinical framework around gray divorce loneliness was built from incomplete data and produces an incomplete and systematically one-sided accountability is real. The specific and documented severity of your post-divorce suffering relative to what the narrative acknowledges is real. The complete accounting holds both. It holds your genuine contribution to what went wrong, alongside the genuine incompleteness of a narrative that has been treating your contribution as the whole story. It holds your responsibility for the development work that your emotional availability failures require, alongside the acknowledgement that the weight you have been carrying was never accurately proportioned to reflect what the marriage actually was and what its failure actually consisted of. That complete accounting is the foundation of a genuine recovery, not the one that assigns you full responsibility for a shared failure, not the one that relieves you of all responsibility for your genuine contributions to it, the one that is accurate, the one that gives you the complete picture of what you are actually carrying and what you can genuinely set down. The accountability epidemic in gray divorce is real. Its effects on men's recovery are real and significant and deserve to be named as such. And the response to it is not the rejection of genuine responsibility, it is the insistence on accurate responsibility, the kind that reflects what the complete evidence actually shows rather than what the incomplete narrative has been assigning. You are not responsible for all of it. You were never responsible for all of it. And the recovery that becomes possible when you stop carrying all of it is the recovery your situation has always deserved. Drop a comment. Men, what has been the specific and most damaging way that the accountability narrative around gray divorce loneliness has affected your recovery and your sense of yourself in the years since the marriage ended? Subscribe to Relational Insights. Every week, Mr. Wesley breaks down the real dynamics of gray divorce and what comes after, with the honesty and the precision that finally gives men the complete and accurate accounting of what they are carrying and what they are genuinely responsible for.